I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Okay, so we're back for episode 2 of season 4, in which we are concentrating on Catholic worker farms. And of course, our first interview was James Murphy, and it was great. And this month, we wanted to talk a little bit about an article that I've been using in research, and I shared with Spencer. It's called The Perennial Nature of the Catholic Worker Farms, a Reconsideration of Failure by Paul V. Stock. It's from 2014. And he was a sociologist, is a sociologist at the University of Kansas. This was published in Rural Sociology in 2014. So, and I focused on the second half of this article, but basically this article covers a question that's very much on our minds all the time, both as people who are involved in the Catholic worker movement, but also as, in the case of Spencer and Emily and the crew there in Kansas City, actually involved in Catholic worker farms and trying to do this. This article covers a lot of historical examples of Catholic worker farms, starting at the beginning and kind of moving forward. It's kind of theory heavy at the beginning, so I basically said I skipped it myself, and I hope you did, because it seemed rather dense, and like if somebody could get through the first half and get to the second half, you would realize like good information in here. But the second half starts to zero in on these historical examples of Catholic worker farms. And, and then the author goes into kind of analysis of why they tend to fail, but also then the message seems to be that failure is maybe too strong of a word, that in some ways all of these different farms and some that last a long time, but some of which last very little time, all of them have kind of added up to more knowledge and also more spread of Catholic worker communities overall. And so he's kind of questioning whether, failure is a good term for this. But I guess I would say Spencer and I are both, obviously, if people have been listening to this podcast a while, interested in why, like, not only farms, but communities, of people who are trying to get together to cooperate with each other like this, why they tend to have trouble and why they don't receive a lot of support from outside, and why they have, internal problems that can lead to their collapse and so on. So this article really it's rare, because the Catholic worker movement in and of itself is a little bit of an esoteric thing. There's, a lot of people don't know about it. We're trying to change that. But it's also like really good. I think the guy does a thorough job in the space of an article. So I don't know, like since I imposed this on you in a way, Spencer, I hope that you found it somewhat informative and interesting.
I mean, I find his whole you kind of like downplay how much time is spent discussing what is failure. And I
Mm.
found I did not buy his argument that, well, actually, I buy his argument. It's just like a sophomoric argument about what failure is. Like, it's like he's trying to refute this idea that failure means you can learn nothing from it, or failure is totally the fault of the people that have seemingly failed. Like
Yeah.
he's responding to that kind of an argument, um, or
I would
non-argument.
agree. Yeah, I would agree with that. I had the same reaction. I don't mind using the term failure. I do think that you can learn from failures and you should learn from failures. And I think maybe one of the problems Catholic workers have, in my opinion, is that they don't learn from failures. They just keep doing the same type of thing. And then so I do think that we can actually learn from failures, and that flexibility is important if we're going to do that. But yeah, I think he was trying hard to rescue the movement from detractors who would say that, well, if they failed so many times, then maybe this isn't a good thing to do. But that is kind of a simplistic rejection to begin with. So I think you're right about that. I had the same reaction. Um, so, I mean, what would you agree that it's okay to just simply say this farm failed? Let's look at why. Therefore, trying to figure out what not to do as well as what to do.
I think so. I mean, I think as we're heading towards, like the 100th anniversary, I think we should go back to all the basics and really take stock of, what are we aiming to do and how do we go about doing that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think where that's hard is I think it's both part of the Catholic mindset in general, and even Catholic workers that think they aren't Catholic, they're still carrying on a mentality that is like very intentionally anti-consequentialist. Like there's this kind of dogmatic emphasis on principles, and we need to just adhere to the principles irregardless of the consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And And my hot take would be, if that's the case, and if we're really about following the little way and embracing failure, then we should, like, my critique of a lot of the Catholic workers I've encountered is that they're not doing the little way enough, and they're not like really embracing failure and irrelevancy. If
Well,
that is the goal.
okay. Could you parse that a little bit? I'm interested in how would they do better at that?
Well, I mean, guapa, place. Sorry, the dogs and the cats. Well, I mean, this is a tough pill to swallow, and I don't want to say that like there's a sense in which who am I to say, but this is what I'm like increasingly feeling like I should try and live out. I'm not even doing this, but increasingly I feel like I should do this, and this article made me feel it even more. That if we're taking Saint Therese as the model and the little way, well, she didn't have a newspaper. She wasn't petitioning politicians to cease wars. She was just in a convent praying, not even writing anything. So
Mhm.
to me, there's a fundamental awkwardness when if somebody wants to say, and granted, Saint Therese, the little way, this wasn't discussed in this paper, but like at the Radlib Catholic Worker that I started volunteering at, they would use the phrase "the little way" as an excuse to justify their political protests having no effect.
Mm, I see. Okay. Yeah, I hadn't heard that because I'm not as attuned to some of the just the communications as you guys are. But yeah, I understand your point. Yeah. I think oftentimes yeah, I mean the word excuse is a good one there, right? Like and something that I felt, and I love the idea. I love a lot of the people in it, but I have felt like there's a sort of dogmatic Puritanism that comes through in the more or less the political ideology or the yeah, just the ideology of the movement that can be kind of like inherently self-defeating because if you put foremost in mind like very, very, very grand goals like, the end of nuclear weapons or the, peace. Not that these are things that we should pray for and work for in any reasonable way that we can. Or if you say, you must, you must, in order to really do this, have apps, like embrace voluntary poverty, and there's really no other way. And then almost everybody fails, including most Catholic workers, because when they get to a certain point in a system such as ours, they have to like survive, and that's legitimate. That's a legitimate need. And so then that's one of the reasons why they leave, right? Is because they can no longer adhere to this really, really stringent set of criteria. Um, I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
I think so. I mean, I think that's one dimension of why people leave. I think that more makes people not self-select in the first place.
yes, that's true.
I think what's more common is then once you swallow that bitter pill, then it's not just about enduring that, but then enduring all the hypocrisies and the compromises that are usually not acknowledged as compromises.
Hmm. What if they were acknowledged? Do you think that would make things better if people were just able to say, this is not the absolute ideal, but we're doing it now because this is what it takes to keep us going?
I think that depends on the people in the community involved.
Yeah.
I think
Well,
sometimes that amount of frankness makes it obvious what's happening and who's calling the shots and how decisions are being made. And part of why people get attracted to these things is usually out of some idea that we can all just like live in a beloved community together and all be seen and heard and validated, and everybody will be more or less happy all the time.
right.
And as soon as you learn that almost always there's like anchors of the community that have way more say, um, you know, you can either accept that or learn the lesson that there's no escape from bourgeois society, and you might as well be comfortable and not living in voluntary poverty when there's no escape from.
Hmm.
I mean, I've said it on here a bunch of times. That's my cynical theory about how Catholic workers primarily function for the people that move into them, just as a kind of grad school AmeriCorps type program for you to learn there is no alternative to being a suburban American, or no
Right.
good alternative, no better alternative for
It's kind of a
you.
way station, right? But it's like, so if a person enters a monastery or, you know, a nunnery or some institution that the church has that's okay, we've got buildings, we've got rooms, we've got a kitchen, we've got structure, we've got order, we've got, you're if you're old, you will be cared for because there's all this infrastructure. Then, even then, as I understand it, people have all kinds of trouble getting along with each other. But it's a whole lot easier to deal with devoting your entire life and sacrificing your wealth when you know, or I should say, your ability to accumulate wealth, if you know that there's this rather massive institution backing you up. And by the way, you don't have to work outside of it. You can devote your whole life to it. And so those work better, right? And it's still they're asking a lot, but they do supply, they're not going to take all your work and then throw you to the curb normally.
And that's the difference between holy poverty, or at least a kind of Benedictine model of holy poverty versus precarity, or what I would call what you tend to find in the Catholic worker world, this kind of hyper Franciscan notion of what poverty is. And taking a few steps back, it's not an accident that the Benedictines are known for having farms and the Franciscans are known for not having farms.
Okay.
And that would be one of my arguments of, as we head towards the centenary, I think we need to take a long, hard look at to what extent is a Franciscan emphasis on poverty fundamentally at odds with being able to make sustainable Catholic worker communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, when the movement first got started, one could live off of good land, and that was also something that people had some experience with and could conceive of. But even then, and we can talk about this pretty soon, but they had a lot of failures because the people who decided to try to do it would often come and they'd be city people, so they didn't know how to do it. But it was something that a lot more people in this country had familiarity with. And in fact, for instance, my own dad, who, as is 2 years away from a century himself, grew up in Kentucky, and it wasn't affected by the Dust Bowl, but it was affected by the Great Depression. So his family didn't have any money. But when they were sharecroppers on a farm, they needed no money. So I think when Peter Maurin came to the United States, he also came from this peasant background where either he participated in or at least witnessed people with zero money but land able to actually take care of themselves. But then with the advent of full-scale capitalism, for an awful lot of people, the vast majority of people no longer have access to land, or if they do, even if they do have massive farms, they still don't know how to feed themselves from their own land. They don't know how to grow food and process it. And all this, those are skills hardly anybody has, right? And so I think times have changed so drastically that the dream of being able to completely be self-sufficient through farming, it can still be done by somebody who has land and really knows what they're doing, for sure. But it's rare. And for that very reason, just doesn't seem like it's quite suited for the times that we live in as a solution, right?
Yeah, and these farms either have to be fairly heavily capitalized, and I don't mean heavily capitalized in an industrial agricultural sense, but from a hyper Franciscan perspective, either we're talking about an not poverty level amount of equipment, and or it has to be a communal effort. And then we're talking about what would it take to foster a community that can create that amount of sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's tough. in the environment that we're in. And we've covered that quite a bit. In fact, that interview we most recently did, we discussed some of that, but it's just like really difficult to, with people kind of conditioned the way they are now to think about self-reliance and individual, space and rights and things, to be able to wrap their head around working really closely with other people and developing that level of trust, right? I mean, that's such a huge challenge now that I think maybe, again, back in the old days, I mean, from the interviews that I did with people in their 80s here in Kansas, we're within a couple of generations of, well, I don't know how many generations, but people are still alive, but in their 80s, still remember so much more just inherent trust in other people and a tendency to believe what they said and to, feel like they would be welcome to work together. And if they needed them, they could ask. And, now we're just so clearly not living in that world that it's stark, and it's happened to us very, very quickly. I feel like if we still know people who are alive who lived a very different way of life relative to the other people in their family and in their area than we do now, you can see the damage that's been wrought by our economic system, by our technology, to our ability to trust and work together. And so we can't assume now, if we ever could, because the Great Depression was like the first big like blowout of capitalism's failure. Failures, it's sort of cyclical failure, I should say. We certainly can't assume now that people are going to be able to follow through on the what seems like genius idea. Like it sounds nice in theory, but super, super difficult in practice because it's the most alien thing in the world.
And every step of the way, it's economically disincentivized.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, what we do with that, I don't know. I mean, that's what we're going to be talking about throughout the year after listening to people's stories. And I might put a plug in for the Grange if you kind of want to know our reaction to interviews. We do more of that for patrons on our Patreon side, where we kind of analyze those interviews. But we're just, people just trying to figure out like what could possibly work, because we do want to live a life that's closer to what, I mean, not to sound too schmaltzy, but to what Jesus wanted for people, right? Like it's a sign of our times that I think I got like not to be too schmaltzy about it, but like that's kind of what we're trying to do. And so like anything that we can, sort of glean from these failures or whatever information we can get is something that we should use. So one of the things I wanted to talk about for sure was just at the end of this article, there's like 3 types of failure that he talks about. And I might preface this by just saying that I've been doing some research. It's very like preliminary on the Easton Pennsylvania Mary Farm, which the dates of its actual founding and closure are a little bit obscure, but it was finally closed or like basically abandoned by Dorothy Day in 1947 after she just could not figure out how to like even get people to get along with each other. So she decided that she was going to divest the Catholic worker of this farm and let these people figure it out for themselves. And I think it was settled in either the late 30s or early 40s. And Peter Maurin had, a lot to do with that vision. and he spent some time there, but not a lot of time there. He was starting to have strokes at that point. His health was not good. And so he wasn't able to be like consistently kind of there to kind of see what was going on, I think. So I'm doing this research because, and I'll be going to Marquette in the archives, Catholic Worker Archives in October, because I feel like understanding the dynamics of that situation so early on might help us learn, something about why these things can go wrong, and then how they, by doing that, how they might go better, you know? So that's the preface. And first of all, I should stop and say, are you familiar with the Mary Farm in Eastern Pennsylvania history?
I mean, from the general Catholic worker literature, I am, like it being mentioned in The Long Loneliness and in William Miller's histories.
Okay, yeah, right.
So, to me, those early houses, there's a lot of blurry overlap, but I mean, there's the famous story of, I think it was Easton turning into a cult, right? And then them doing raids on the other worker house.
Yeah. Yeah, which seems pretty extreme, right? Like when I first read about that, I was like, whoa, this is above and beyond, man. So this guy, I have some notes and I'll read some of this, just kind of give people an idea. So it was a 28-acre farm near Easton, and it was supposed to be a retreat and communal farm. So it was kind of like a mesh between Dorothy Day's vision, which was to have a retreat for both Catholic workers and for some people, who needed rest from the city to go to the countryside. Maurin had more of an idea of a agronomic university, which is kind of like what the Maurin Academy aspires to be, where farming would take place, but also, intellectual activity would take place, learning would take place. So anyway, they founded this, and both of those visions were present. And then in the 40s, this person named Guy Tobler arrived in the early 40s, I think. And he was a lawyer, and he had one of these sort of domineering type of personalities. And so he was able to get some of the families that settled on I think it was the upper farm. There was the upper farm and the lower farm. He was able to get these upper farm families to kind of like come under his leadership and control. And he started to impose rules like women can't be involved in decision making. And eventually he just sort of like went off the rails, and he was actually asking people to do things like prostrate themselves before him. And in between that, like the moderately like distasteful and the crazy were those raids where, they believed that the people in the lower farm who were trying to run the retreat had stuff that they needed, and they should basically just grab it. And they were not happy or friendly and didn't cooperate with them otherwise. So clearly, Guy Tobler was one of those cult figures that you see sometimes. And he was just a big problem. And I think this kind of snuck up on Dorothy Day. And then, so tensions grew between Tobler and Dorothy Day and others. There were disruptions of retreats because Tobler and his followers would try to interfere with those retreats. And then basically in 1944, Dorothy Day sold part of the farm and relinquished part of Mary Farm to Tobler's followers and sold the remaining part of the farm and just walked away from it because she could not figure out how to make that situation better. And I think the Tobler people hung on for quite some time afterwards. I'm still learning about this stuff, so I don't know for sure. But like the other part, I think dissolved faster. you know? So obviously, in that case, we have a case of one person coming in from the outside fairly early on with a domineering, controlling, kind of culty personality who, for whatever reason, was able to. This is the real question for me, is like, how is this guy able to get these other people who are obviously, they got to be somewhat of free spirits to be able to be like, yeah, I think I'll go like homestead on this Catholic worker farm in the midst of the Great Depression, you know? So, I mean, these people were not exactly like probably wallflowers, but somehow this guy worked all this destruction and just was a huge wrecking ball. And I know that this happens. It happens all the time in groups and organizations that that one figure can come in and just like, boom, everything is destroyed. Okay. Now I can kind of see it coming. I can see him coming, you know, but like, took me a while to figure that one out. But anyway, like, do you have anything to add or like any other things that you've read about this situation?
I mean, I don't have any specific insights to add other than like this is the flip side of, again, where I would argue the movement was getting some early feedback about nonviolence and radical openness. Is like, how far do you want to take it? Do you want to let a crazy guy take over your farm?
Okay, that's a great point. Yeah, so those people were probably geared to, well, we're trying to get along, you know, and we don't want to have some sort of like massive structure or set of rules to kind of, we want to trust each other, right? So do you think naivete had something to do with it, maybe?
I mean, I cannot speak to the people that were on the farm at the time, but in the abstract, I think it's, in this article, we're talking about there were three main causes of quote unquote failure. And the first one was character and personality. And anytime you're doing a small, intimate, personalistic enterprise, you are always going to be vulnerable to whether you want to conceive of them as strong characters or weak characters. Like if there isn't a critical mass to resist somebody like that, then they're like inevitably going to take over.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I do know that a lot of people who are involved in movements like this are inherently kind of nice. Nice is not the probably the exact word I want. But they're forgiving, they're nice, they want to get along, uh, they're idealistic. And so,
They want to believe that people can change if you just give them enough time.
mm-hmm, yeah. And then there's these psychological mechanisms which we all know about, but few of us think it'll ever like it'll never happen to me. But when somebody begins to become very authoritative, um, other people really don't like conflict or confrontation, and they will try to appease first and sort of try to smooth things over. But then there's this tilting point where that becomes just domination. And by then, most people don't fully realize what's happened to them. It's a process, but this is the cult formation dynamic, right? And so, people doing this type of work need to watch for that and realize that almost anybody too can be kind of sucked into this over time, right? And needs to be on the lookout. But then the question is, what do you do with this type of, how do you push back in a situation like this? I mean, even Dorothy Day just was like, I can't deal with this. I guess I'll just have to get out of it, which is, she, in other words, our one of our two like inspirational leaders could not figure out how to deal with that situation.
I mean, to me, it points up, if we take seriously her idea of, her quote about "Don't call me a saint." It's funny to me that some of the people that seem the most ardent in being opposed to the church declaring her a saint seemingly want to make her like an anti-pope and some sort of like paragon of practical infallibility and perfect political theory, instead of viewing her as like, a human being who was juggling too many things out on a limb.
Mm-hmm.
And, we shouldn't be surprised that she didn't know how to handle things, but especially, we're bringing a kind of bias that she could hopefully have cop some sort of like quote unquote authoritarian move to kick him out or put him in line or something like that.
That wouldn't be very saint-like, would it? That's something I would do. But I don't pretend to be like a very good pretty much anything, but I would go straight to power struggle shutdown, which is why I'm not necessarily super well suited for this. And I think it's okay for people to admit that, that they can't handle everything, or, what their limitations are. And I think you make a good point that Dorothy Day never claimed to be some sort of font of all wisdom and order. She was just kind of making it up as she went along too.
Right. I mean, the line in The Long Loneliness is that she said, "I'm a journalist and a diarist, pure and simple," which for me is the grounds too, as we head towards that centenary. Let's reevaluate Dorothy Day's role. She's not our Pope presiding over an infallible magisterium whose guidelines we must always stick to the letter and the spirit.
So true, right? And Peter Maurin too. I mean, he provided some intellectual weight in the early movement, but he wasn't around long enough and he didn't write enough to be able to give just a whole lot of guidance either. And he was also just a human being with his own quirks and weaknesses and so forth. And we shouldn't be like, this is such a tendency for people to, like the Americans always going back to the founding. I mean, there's some utility in that, but when the founding and the founders become this kind of ironclad, source of all order, as though if you just understood what they oracularly said, that you would then be able to solve every problem you've got, is, of course, ludicrous. They wouldn't have known what to do with 2025. In fact, 2025 kind of shows that they didn't have it all worked out, because our system is not able to handle, at least it probably won't be able to handle some of the stressors that it's experiencing right now. So, but we do that because we want to make, it's the God instinct, like you're going straight to Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, sort of like
Well, again, did they found a religious congregation? And were they inspired saints? And do we just need to sort of pray enough to them that they will lavish on us the graces to do all the right thing? And most Catholic workers wouldn't want to look at the situation that way. I'm more willing to look at it that way as a Catholic, but I still think there's more space to innovate than I think a lot of people think there is. But that requires compromise, and that opens you to the charge that you are apostatizing from the tenets of the religious congregation.
And that's religious thinking. And I guess I would argue that the only religious thinking that is really necessary is when you're actually dealing with your religion, and not with kind of like your thoughts about how to on the ground implement it, right? Like if it's directed towards God, or in our case with Christianity, Jesus as like God's representative on earth, absolutely. But as far as, should we always like faithfully try to figure out exactly what Day and Maurin thought and then live it out somehow? I don't think they would have wanted that. They were both like good but flawed human beings like the rest of us. And they were trying to figure stuff out. Peter Maurin had all kinds of problems. He had a tendency to like just leave and come back when he wanted to, just sort of walked away. I don't know why. And then he had health problems. He ended up having something like dementia. And this was, I mean, he died pretty young. And before then, his mental capacity was slipping, and which is not his fault, but like we don't really, they were just people, you know. So to like worry too much about exactly what they were trying to live out what Jesus taught. Like I watched a short video of Dorothy Day being interviewed by somebody. It was just 3 minutes long, but she basically said within those 3 minutes, well, Jesus has these, you know, beatitudes, and it's pretty pleasant to just listen to, but if you actually try to live it out, is really, really hard and challenging. I'm paraphrasing. And she looked troubled. This was Dorothy Day, is a very old lady. And
Who'd
so
done more than most people to try and live it out.
she absolutely did, absolutely did. And she was saying, you know, Jesus's teachings were her guide. And so I think that's what we ought to probably, as Catholic workers, at least if we're like motivated by Christianity, we probably should do that. Jesus's teachings are universal and timeless, and then you figure out how to best work with them within your time period. I don't think Dave would want to take the place of Jesus, I guess is what I'm saying.
Obviously, yeah. I mean, this conversation, it's kind of like him trying to recontextualize violence. Like what we're saying is pretty obvious and banal. As an aside, Peter Maurin was 72 when he died in 49.
Okay, well, I think that's older than I thought he was, but but he was slipping for quite a while. He spent the last few years. But then that doesn't, see, one of the things I want to find out is why did he leave all the time? If it wasn't dementia and it wasn't, you know, like mental illness, why the heck was he like just disappearing? Because Dorothy Day famously is all about, he's gone again. Where is he?
To me, where it's legible is he was pretty clearly some kind of autistic.
Oh,
And he probably couldn't deal with getting rejected in the sense of his ideas not being followed to the T.
oh, that's insightful. Wow.
I'm
Yeah,
not saying
you're
that's
right.
all that was going on, but that to me is very plausible and sufficient to explain it.
Good point. Because another thing he did was he talked at people, you know, like he didn't have two ways very often, it sounds like.
Right. I mean, there's the whole story, I don't know where, probably in the long loneliness, about they were worried about Dorothy's daughter's wedding and whether or not he was going to crash it by doing another performance of Pigs for Profit
Oh, yeah.
at the wedding reception.
Because he didn't have social sense of, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, that, even if, I mean, of course, there's no way to ever prove that, but I think that actually makes a lot of sense. And it certainly explains the disappearances, because maybe that was his basically meltdown point. Like, I can't deal with this anymore. I need to go off and just kind of, I don't know, like reset or whatever. But interesting. Yeah. Well, he was obviously somebody who absorbed a great deal of information and then tried to digest it and give it to people. I wish to heck that he had more of his stuff was like recorded. That would be so nice, because I think he gave a lot of that out in speeches and conversations. And I'm going to see if there's any of that going on at the archives, but they've already told me there's a lot less Maurin material than there is Day material. So I'll be focusing on like one or two boxes. To get to so we're still on the type 1 failure of character. One of the things that that he talks about in this article is there's the failure of personality, which we just kind of covered, but also there's just the knowledge failure of, which I felt was kind of like maybe the wrong word to use, failure of character. If somebody has no knowledge of farming and is not prepared to do physical work, and comes to a farm, I would call that naivete and optimism and kind of utopianism, but I wouldn't call it a character failure.
Whereas I would categorize that as a species of character failure.
Okay, and why?
There's a far more eloquent scholastic way to put this, I'm sure. But like everything you just described, whether it's the naivete or the idealism, it's a vice because it's disconnected from reality. And so all of those things basically are sins against imprudence or something like that. And so they indicate a faulty way of approaching reality that will inherently be punished.
You mean sins against prudence, right? Like sins of imprudence.
Yes.
Gotcha. And so you're saying that if somebody comes into this situation and they haven't done their due diligence of trying to figure out what is required, and they just think that they're going to be able to just do it because it's a good thing to do, that is a kind of character flaw.
I think so. And it may be, that would be covered up if they had all these other virtues that did allow them to figure things out very quickly and on the fly. But if they aren't compensating for those vices with other virtues, then it's in that negative situation.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I see where you're going, because if somebody comes to a farm and they're saying, I don't know how to do anything, and then they refrain from doing anything or barely kind of putz around and don't really try very hard, then they've really got a problem. But we've both seen people who knew very little, but who really wanted to apply themselves and learn, and they can kind of get up to speed pretty quick, but they have to have a lot of tenacity, which is a character benefit, right? It's a good character quality to have tenacity and patience and fortitude and things like that. But we've also seen people that just not necessarily in any particular aspect of life, but I've certainly seen my share of people who just had idealistic ideas, and then when it didn't work out, they were like, I just don't know, I can't.
So it's a failure of character. There's a line in this where he says, trying to be all things to all people, the Catholic worker farm experiments probably struck some as schizophrenic. A Lower East Side newspaper woman and a group of would-be farmers planting seeds with a ruler and a hardback how-to manual. Not really the recipe for a transformative social movement.
I read that too, and I thought, man, how long did that ruler last? Right? Like, oh my goodness. I couldn't believe anybody did that. So wow.
Yeah, he goes on, it's easy to see how historians of the worker, including Day herself, often resorted to describing the farm efforts as failures.
That's somebody who thinks of planting seeds as very, very scientific and also orderly. Out at the community farm, there are community gardens that Dad and I grow some of our stuff on. There are plots where everything is, well, I think they've used herbicide, because outside of where the plants are, there's nothing, first of all. So there's these blank spaces of 2 feet of just absolute patina or whatever that is, the hard bake, dirt that's got nothing on it. And then you have these little neat rows of absolutely evenly spaced vegetables, and you can do that if you really, why, I don't know, because I think it has more to do with aesthetics than anything else. But you can do that if you have like, I think these are 20 by 20 pieces of ground. Sure, if you want to create a work of art and make it all precise and straight and everything, you can do that. However, it serves no purpose as far as growing things. But yeah, like I don't know. If somebody read a book about gardening, for instance, now we have the square method, right? Where a person makes a 4x4 and then they divide it into, I think it's 8 squares, and then you plant one plant right smack dab in the middle of each square. You could end up that way if you read a book, but after you do it for a while, it's so exhausting. And why would you do that, right? So that really rang a bell with me. I'm like, wow, that is, but to do that and not learn from that, right? Like I would do that 1 year and then I'd be, oh no, that's way too exhausting. I don't know.
But the issue is, it's jumping ahead to the third type of failure, but it's contextual. And they cite World War II and real estate prices as contextual, but the whole issue is like agriculture was on the cusp of really industrializing.
So do you think that the techniques of industrial agriculture had kind of penetrated their own methods?
No, what I'm saying is when you live in an industrial society, it sucks to go be a serf. Most people aren't going to want to do it. Contextually, there's this constant pressure inviting you to quit being a serf and go make more money doing less labor.
Yeah, even during the Great Depression, though, I mean, nobody could find any work.
Right. At least during the Depression, you would think that maybe people would want to farm, but they could barely find people to do it. And that was during the Depression. Now we have ultra processed foods.
Right. Yeah. No, now I can, and this is one of those big changes that we all need to take into account somehow is now, generally speaking, unless we have a crisis, it's just so freaking easy for people to go get cheap, kind of low quality, but cheap calories, right, at a grocery store. And that's what people are used to, which makes it just so easy to walk away. And we should talk more about that, but maybe let's go back to type 2. Let's make sure we talk about type 2. That was the location size. He says the location or size can contribute to a type 2 failure is represented by Mary Farm number 2 at Newburgh, New York. A prospective retreat farm did not enjoy an airstrip as a neighbor, so that's why that failed. Thus, the second incarnation of Mary Farm in Newburgh was shuttered in 1955. Similarly, the first attempt by the Catholic worker on a rented Staten Island beachfront property with poor soil was quickly abandoned. And he talks about the Catholic worker farm history is full of experiments on poor land most often available for those without farming experience, capital, or a credit line, which is a good point. That, people who have no money aren't going to have their pick of excellent, farmland. They're gonna be farming in areas with all sorts of obstacles, which is going to cut down on their success. So here, I don't think he's saying, this is their fault. It's just that this is what oftentimes they had to deal with. Right.
Yeah. Sure. What to say? I mean, I think you could recontextualize it if point of failure 3 was like the global context or the national context. Type 2 is like an immediate context. The land and the surrounding environment, social or geological, are not conducive for farming.
Right. Something came to mind. So one of the workarounds for this that my father, because of the time period that he grew up in, and his family took advantage of, was literally using other people's property that was good. So they would go and they would ask, like, okay, you've got a yard, it looks pretty good. Can we grow some stuff here? And then you take part of it and we take part of it. And they did this with quite a few yards. And then another relative of his didn't have good growing space, but he had the ability to make seedlings using compost beds. So he would grow a lot of seedlings, which then could be used by them or sold to other people. But they did that kind of really low scale sharecropping with individual homeowners. I mention that because that is not, that's not a farm, but it is a way of growing food. And sometimes I wonder if we just lack imagination about how to get the access to land. It was a great idea, cooperating with people, but also they got it at the time. So we still have that obstacle of, well, why would I do that now? I can just go to the grocery store. At that time, coming up to somebody and saying, hey, I'll grow it, you can eat it, we'll share. That was a very attractive option for them then, right? And it shows an adaptation for somebody who has no property of their own to be able to use property and make it productive. But I mean, not recommending people do that now. I'm just saying, people can think outside the box if they really need to.
But the issue is, this is where I get annoyed that usually when people are confronting the fact that the surrounding context overdetermines failure, then we have to go to what in Marxism is called an immiseration hypothesis, where we're basically imagining what all would have to fail to get people to quote unquote wake up and then start behaving in the ways that we would like to see them behave.
Yeah. And so you want to not go there?
I mean, I think it's a whole intellectual game people play.
Oh, absolutely. I do it. I mean, I will admit to that. I tend to believe that we can't get cooperation until the proverbial shit hits the fan pretty hard. I mean, real cooperation. I don't want that. I definitely want otherwise. But in my more cynical moments, that's because there's so much more evidence that that's true.
Right. No, whereas I think it's naive. I don't think it's cynical.
Okay.
I think it's naive because it assumes, well, one, there's like Lenin's point that basically, analogously, Lenin's point is that the political party already has to exist before the political crisis occurs. Otherwise, you're not organized to take advantage of the political crisis.
Right.
So I think there's a Leninoid point about that. And then connected with that is that if there's no we, whoever we is, but people that would like to be organized to, whether it's just, start growing in our immediate environment or enact some sort of reform that would make the world a better place. If there is no we, then it's going to be left to other pre-existing we's to take advantage of the situation and not let the crisis go to waste for their interest.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my, in local food, a really common coping mechanism is to say, well, when things get really bad, people are going to wake up and realize we have to do small scale sustainable agriculture. And I'm like, yeah, or billions of dollars will be spent to convince people that this is why we need to be eating meat made in factories, because we cannot afford to grow naturally anymore. And it's so much more efficient, quote unquote, to do it this way.
Yeah, that's a scary picture. Did you know, by the way, just weird factual aside, that we import in the United States, cattle capital of the entire globe, we import, I think, about 10 or 15% of our beef because there's so much demand that this country can't even keep up with it, which is just gross, actually. I'm sorry. It's just like, God, I mean, and it also shows we aren't serious about even producing, enough for our own needs. But anyway,
you just got to let go and accept we're global citizens and the capital must flow. And
I know. So let me make sure I get this straight though. Like you think that the sort of Lenin-like message of we will have the vanguard ready, when the crisis happens, is kind of serves as a coping mechanism. Like remember we talked to the permaculture dude, Dave Holmgren, right? And his concept of permaculture was sort of like, well, the Permaculture Institute exists. We're doing all these things. We're showing people how it can be done. At a certain point when climate change is really bad, and, peak oil has depleted our great energy source, people are going to have to learn new ways, and we have it all laid out for them. And I found that somewhat of a decent motivation, I guess. But I do kind of see it is a coping mechanism too. Is there any sort of redeeming though to that kind of position in your view?
I mean, insofar as it's true.
We hope, right?
Possible. What it comes down to is, when you're trying to play that game, whenever the crisis comes, will you actually be the person they call?
Right. I mean,
Are you
yeah.
going to be at the table or are you going to be on the menu? And so I was saying the Leninoid perspective is not coping. It's actually being, I think, it's actually being sober and responsible. And it's the
Okay.
immiseration hypothesis are the coping because it's imagining that things will just change. And then everybody will wake up and realize what you and I and whoever is indulging in this fantasy, everybody will wake up and realize how right our perspective and vision is.
Okay, that's making sense to me. Yeah. The only thing is, like, so Lenin had this idea that, the revolution had to have teeth, and, the vanguard had to be more or less armed, and, at a certain point, like, just force the situation, right? Which realistically, um, well, it's very realistic. Whereas I think we would have to rely on, will people see the benefit of having people like us around, right? Who know how to do these things and can teach others and can help organize? Or are they just going to basically use people and I think that's, sadly, I mean, you do the best you can, right? And I don't think we need to have teeth. I don't think that would be true to the vision. Um, but in that case, then, we are kind of in the position of the sheep, right? That um maybe sheared, and in that type of scenario. And I think that's probably just the risk that you have to take if you want to remain nonviolent and you want to be um, true to the teachings of Jesus as a Christian. But yeah, like, there's no guarantee that people in that situation would see David Holmgren's operation as anything other than to take over, you know, and think that they can do it better and not have to listen to him. People in, who like take over, they always think that they understand everything immediately and can do it better than the people who've been doing it a long time. That's just, I'm speaking from years of experience of seeing this even at education institutions, right? Where it's just perennial, right? Newbie enters in. I know what I'm doing. Don't need you. Don't need to talk to you. Don't need to figure out how you've been doing things. I'll take your office. I'll take your whatever you've been doing and I'll make it better. Goodbye. So, but what else are you going to do, right? Like, this is probably the best. Who could ask for more? Right? Oh, this is it. Our conversations always go so dark. uh, anyway, would you correct me in any way? I mean, like, or can you add some silver lining to that, Laurie?
I don't know about silver lining. I mean, for me, the point of making this like Leninoid point is to just say like the organization needs to be happening tomorrow, today, and like should have been happening decades ago.
Yeah.
Now, to take this article at its word, he claims this organization is happening because he doesn't really go into details, but he basically says the farms are successful because there are more of them than ever, more or less.
Mhm.
And he asserts, and doesn't really show any evidence unless I missed it, that they've learned the lessons from the more naive hippie past.
Yeah,
But
he asserts that.
which immediately strikes me as a kind of like liberal idealism that again, there's like a we, and we're like a hive mind, and we are learning so deeply that we will not repeat the failures of the past. That immediately on the face of it, I suspect such arguments.
Yeah, no ways.
Now,
No
do you
ways.
have, am I mischaracterizing his argument in here?
No, I think you've characterized it really well. And I think he's expressing, maybe unconsciously, but he's expressing more of a hope than a fact. I don't think people are like that. I don't think they ever have been like that. Like I just said, that the more the longer I've lived, the more I'm convinced that most people, even smart people, can't learn from other people. They have to figure it out for themselves. And so they spend most of the time reinventing, and maybe by the end of their lives, if they're lucky, they now like have learned a few things, maybe. But by then, the whole cycle starts over again. And this is something that's a huge challenge for human beings because we're not computers, we're not AI. If we were, this would happen, right? Like, and I mean, if you build the right principles into it anyway, progress would occur if we thought like this and if we had that type of way of proceeding. But we're not. We're emotional. We're egotistical. We're anything but the type of creatures that want to learn from our mistakes and actually correct them and build on that basis, because people will hang on to their bad ideas or like they'll hang on to something they've created like it's their baby, like their firstborn. And well, I'm thinking of what Socrates said. Socrates said, that a lot of ideas were like stillborn babies or, malformed infants, and that needed to be, this is kind of mean, but the ancient Greeks would expose those. So, like, he would say that, they should be put aside, right? But the problem that keeps most people from ever moving forward in their thinking is that they will cling to those malformed babies, malformed ideas, as though they're their very offspring who they will love no matter what and will defend to the death. That was the obstacle that Socrates saw, like, and it's still the case. So we have this enlightenment caricature of ourselves that we can learn like a computer. But the reality is that we find it very, very hard, especially in moral matters, like technology. Sure, we can build on technology, sometimes real scary ways.
Although I'd argue really we're just doing that because we have industrial complexes that allow us to do it.
Right. Yeah. Makes it easy. And that's what the whole thing is geared to produce. But morally, have we really advanced, or have we even, I think, maybe even regressed, if anything?
I think so.
Right. And if so, then his hope is, it's hope. I mean, it's good to have hope, but it's on shakier ground than maybe he wants.
Well, and then we're back at the scholastic distinction between hope and wishing. Hope is has a real basis, and wishing doesn't have to have any basis.
Right. So he's wishing.
That's the question.
Well, I think that,
is he wishing or hoping?
the hope is partly it's got the spiritual dimension, right? And I think that hope is based on God and God's promises to us more than it is on our own things. And I think that's what allows genuine hope that's not unrealistic, whereas wishing is I mean, it is kind of tied up with just human infallibility, the idea that human reason is in and of itself without any aid going to be able to triumph, which is obviously incorrect. So hope is tied up with God. I mean, is that kind of what, I don't know, like, was that more or less what you would say as well?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that hope is a theological virtue, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd argue we can place a certain amount of hope in natural realities. I'm hoping this chair I'm sitting on isn't going to just collapse. We can hope in nature's ability to like heal and adapt to some extent. And I guess that's the difference between hope and presumption,
Okay.
hoping for too much.
And hoping's always aware that some failure may occur.
Yeah.
I mean, it's based on the existence of failure. Um, okay. Well, and then the third category here is, and we've already touched on it a little bit, but it's historical context. So he says historical context can also lead farms to fail, though not necessarily solely related to the global economy. The contextual aspects related to money and global events contributed to the sale and closure of the Peter Maurin farm in the 1960s, as well as the large number of closures during World War II, closures that represent a Type 3 failure. Peter Maurin Farm on Staten Island was sold following the completion of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. While Peter Maurin Farm enjoyed the most success as an actual farming venture, the historical reality of the value of real estate skyrocketing led the Catholic worker to cash out and establish Tivoli. And then Tivoli turned out to be pretty bad and didn't work. Did that surprise you? I didn't know about that.
I mean, I did because about a month ago we went over that bridge.
Oh,
We'd been told by James's girlfriend Renee that the Verrazano is what sealed the deal on that farm.
okay.
But now where he's making a bit of a jump is it's not totally obvious why they had to sell, or like they could have sold. He didn't go into the details, and it's like, did they have to sell, or did it just make a lot of financial sense to do it?
It might be interesting to find out because, yeah, I thought that the term cash out was pretty stark. I mean, it rang. I don't think he was necessarily trying to be critical, but he was being very matter of fact and maybe assuming that they were just like, "Lou, this is now worth, what was it, $175,000 as opposed to the $15,000 we paid for it." And maybe it was also that with that bridge and all of the development going on as a result of it, it just wasn't deemed a good place to continue to farm too.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So,
And I mean, I'm not complaining one way or another. There was a jump in the argument.
mhm. Right. He didn't elaborate on why they did that, in which case I kind of wish he hadn't used the term cash out because that's a judgment, right? So it would be interesting to know more about that, but you're right, he doesn't say. Um, so as of this like third failure, seems to me like this is the most uncontroversial statement of all, which is that things change, times change, global events happen, and those things can either positively or negatively affect people's ability to continue to run these farms. So,
Mhm.
I mean, now you would think that maybe like the fact that Dorothy Day is about to be or is in the process of canonization, and so her name is rising to greater prominence, would and is kind of inspiring more people, I think, to get involved in the Catholic worker movement. So that would be a positive event. But
Yeah. But the Linenoid question is, what movement are these people coming into?
yeah, it's a hodgepodge, isn't it?
And if they do come into the movement, how will they impact it?
Right. Well, I would like to think that they would bring modern sensibilities and different skill sets and priorities to the movement because you always need that, right? The way to solve homelessness now is probably not the way people solved homelessness even 20 years ago, let alone back in the Great Depression. And and so and the way that people communicate is radically different. We don't primarily read newspapers anymore, you know. We get on our phone and, you know, look at them sometimes, but you know, so there's these things that have radically changed, and I guess if I were looking for something positive about all these people who are kind of trying it out, younger people right now, it would be that they come with their experience of a fairly different world than some of our previous generations have encountered. And therefore, they might be able to solve or help, like, deal with the context in which they're working better. I don't know. I hope so.
I hope so too.
All right. Well, that's let's see if there's anything else in this chapter. By the way, I put a little frowny face next to cash out because I like, oh, it's kind of like rough. Overall, he's very nice to the Catholic worker movement, but no, I mean that's all the notes I've got on that. Any last thoughts, I guess, on I guess we probably should wrap it up soon, but any last thoughts on the article or just like how you personally react to it because you're there on the farm and
Yeah, I mean, I feel like as a farm, we've like mostly failed. And to the extent that we haven't failed, it's just that we've like gritted our teeth and kept going and we're still here. And I guess to me, as somebody, that he would want to consider, I guess, a success because we're at least surviving and everything's in quote unquote process. So who knows what emergent possibilities will come out of either our farm or our contributions to the movement. I mean, to me, it goes back to like the stuff I was saying about Saint Therese before, that I don't see how any of this, like I feel so like socially alienated that I can't see any way that like what we're doing here adds up to something beyond. Now now maybe I'm just being like myopic and not seeing the long-term effects of what we're doing. And I hear that argument. I don't see any kind of like lasting impact or inspiration we're having on people.
it would be nice to hear from more people, right? Like if they, whether it's through encountering the Maurin Academy or podcast here or have like checked out your farm and gotten some inspiration from it to actually hear from them. Because I think a lot of times people will, and I think I mean, they will like encounter it, they'll get some inspiration, they'll get some ideas from it, but they feel like for those who find it, many of them feel like, well, it's obvious, or, why would they need me to like give them some feedback or communicate? You know, but it's pretty important in an endeavor like this because you're giving a lot of your time for very little to no, worldly reward. And so hearing from other people, I think it would help like us to gauge what kind of impact we're actually having. And so I guess I wasn't planning on saying this, but I guess I would just invite people to, contact us or engage with us a little bit more, either through the Maurin Academy or through the farm. And, in the notes, of course, I'll always put information about how you can do that. But if you've been listening to us for a while, now might be your chance to get involved a little bit more. And, even we have, like for the farm, we do invite visitors who want to stay for a couple of weeks or longer. We've got a house where people can stay and work alongside us and learn. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, I know you oftentimes you feel like, I wonder, how many people I'm reaching or just how much of an impact I'm actually having in an endeavor like this. You just never really fully know, do you?
No, and I mean, to some extent, that's like all of human life. again, using Saint Therese as a model, who would think that she'd be a doctor of the church, and so the story goes, lavishing all sorts of spiritual help on all sorts of people and places,
Mhm.
whereas she barely left her town and her monastery during her life.
Right.
That's something, that's a totally different model for how to live your life, your end goal, what you're trying to accomplish. That's a whole different thing than I'm going to go protest, or even I'm going to establish a successful farm. Because in the one, you're like giving up literally everything to God. And in the other, we're trying to enact concrete material changes to reality.
Right.
And that's, to me, where my forehead starts to wrinkle, as somebody wants to justify the material changes they're trying to do by saying, and again, it won't always be I'm doing the little way, but it'll be I'm doing a small thing, or I'm being truly humble. Um, and then and then saying, to me, this is the kind of heart of darkness thing, the claim that, like, I'm not interested in the outcome, while telling people that you want a specific outcome.
Hmm.
I don't care that my protests for world peace aren't bringing world peace,
Right. Yeah.
but I want to tell everybody we need peace.
Right.
That to me is like, why don't we just hang out in our monasteries then?
Yeah. What's the point of that? Right. Like effectiveness. I think we both have agreed on this for a long time, that effectiveness is one of it's not the only thing, right? But if what you're doing has no effect other than maybe your own spiritual growth or purification, it could be better, or maybe it should be better, or maybe it should kind of trouble you that it's not better, which doesn't mean, like if we should be aiming at perfection, which no one is ever going to obtain, or that we're going to solve all the world's problems, which we're not. But if you're not at all concerned about, to use a contemporary word, impact, it's, yeah. So I've always been very forthright about that, right? Like I'm going to continue to concern myself with that.
Right. Whereas I'm more willing to jettison even being all that worried about impact, and just double down on what I'm doing as being as right as I can figure it out to be.
Yeah. And just
Um,
hope that it has the impact.
yeah, and or like surrender that. I'm more at the point of like surrendering that hope, because I don't, I mean, I think about this all the time, that like, if I could go back in time and know how my visit to Kansas City turned out, what I would basically be confronted with is, I feel like, almost a barely mitigated failure in every attempt to organize with other people. At least so far. We'll see. This year is going generally better than other years, but barely mitigated failure in my attempts to organize with other people, other than meeting and marrying Emily. Everything else has been a wash, and I feel like part of my blinders was coming from like small city small city Western Kansas. I had a naive notion of how, like, with it and active and organized people were in cities.
Mm.
And so to find what I perceived to be such a malaise, not just like with me and my farm, but like all of the quote unquote progressive attempts to do organization in this city. Yeah, I don't know. I feel the call to go back to the land, because the city ain't where it's at. If if
That's
the point is to have an impact, and if the point is to be creating a new society in the shell of the old, I feel like I found mostly exhaustion.
I think that's legit. Cities are centers of commerce, right? Like, and so even the progressives that care, that say that they care a lot about, food, the environment, and so on, they tend to commodify those things, and they tend to think in terms of business relationships and networks and projects, and they're very much in the model of those types of actions. And I think that we've both encountered that what you don't encounter is, do you want to live your life differently? That doesn't compute with a lot of well-meaning progressive people who eat at the right restaurants, or buy the right produce, or can speak the language of whatever the latest Michael Pollan dude is, or whatever. But that doesn't really mean that they're not thinking deeply as like economic actors who think in business terms and who want to. Well, I just got to reading that book, Failing Forward. It has this term, and I'm not recalling it right now, but basically the idea is that capitalism can be, businesses and capital generally can be sort of like massaged and made intelligent by proper workings of businesses and their relationships. We can save the planet, we can have healthy food, we can be all wholesome, and at the same time continue to make a lot of money, oftentimes out of stuff, honestly, that's superfluous, right? That people don't really need. And it's all good. And that dream of being able to have it all, I think it's very, not that other places don't have it, but cities are populated by well-intentioned liberals, or whatever you want to call them, that really don't think they have to like change the way they live. So I think this might be part of the problem. Now, when you go to the country, right? Like, are you going to find people who don't think that way? I don't know. Maybe fewer people that pretend to be. I find it kind of like refreshing when I don't meet people who pretend to be concerned about things that they're not ever going to do anything substantial about. I prefer people who just say, I don't get it, and then you can actually maybe talk to them about why something might be worth getting, right? So I don't know. But I think am I articulating part of what your problem is with now that you're looking back and you're like, did I need to move to a city?
I mean, it's part of it. I wouldn't say, yes, that's one dimension of what's happening for sure. But it's even people that don't have much to lose are also like, it feels like every strata of society I've encountered, it was a character defect on my part, my naivete. I didn't realize how inert every strata of society is in terms of even being like self-critical of itself and the way it's functioning. Just the amount of people who think that they're like with it and progressive and still think what we need to do is raise the minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
Like I view part of it, one aspect of what I'm saying and where I've grown very disillusioned with Kansas City is it's like a practical anti-intellectualism. The idea that like that is like a respectable theory of how things could be made better.
It's kind of I think of it as a form of denial, honestly. They're just in denial about what it would take to make things better. And they don't want to think about it too hard. So yeah, I think we can learn from our mistakes, hopefully. Like, let's take a lesson from this. And it's not that we wouldn't continue to make them, but maybe strive to be the exception rather than the rule here,
Right. And I mean, it's this typology of failure. Type 1, character and personality. Type 2, environmental. And type 3, contextual. I mean, people could apply that to any aspect of their life, really.
Yeah,
So,
that's for sure. It's very useful. Yeah, this is the part I liked. Well, maybe we should wrap it up for this time, but next month we'll have an interview. I don't think we've revealed exactly who that's going to be yet, unless you know.
Colin Miller.
Okay, it's going to be Colin Miller. Okay, I got his book. So,
And Tyler Hamby,
oh,
Maurin House.
all right, great.